Good evening, Erev Tov, and welcome. My name is Michael Lerner, and I am the President and CEO of Qatar. In keeping with our commitment to Holocaust studies, we present the Dressmakers of Auschwitz, the true story of the women who sewed to survive, by Lucy Adlington. As summarized by Pima County Public Library on its website, this powerful book draws on a vast array of sources, including interviews with the last surviving seamstress, telling the story of the brave women who used their sewing skills to survive the Holocaust, exposing the greed, cruelty, and hypocrisy of the Third Reich. After 2 years, I came to the Auschwitz headquarters building, where I worked as a seamstress in the sewing room for SS families. I worked 10 to 12 hours a day. I am one of few who survived the hell of Auschwitz. These are the words of Olga Kovacs. A fashion salon in Auschwitz? The very idea is a hideous anomaly. However, upper tailing, as it was called, encapsulated the values at the core of the Third Reich, qualities of privilege and indulgence, bound up with plunder, degradation, and mass murder. The Auschwitz dressmaking workshop was established by Hedwig Haus, the camp commandant's wife. This is a chronicle of the women who used their sewing skills to survive the Holocaust, stitching beautiful clothes at an extraordinary fashion workshop created within one of the most notorious World War II death camps. By the light of the windows, a group of women in white headscarves would sit at long wooden tables, heads bent over garments, needles in, needles out, needles in, needles out. It was a basement room. The sky beyond the windows did not represent freedom. This was their refuge. Next to the main workshop was a private fitting room for clients, all under the guidance of Marta, a prisoner who had not long since ran her own successful salon in Bratislava. 25 women, all Jews, working in total, ranging in age from the late teens and early 20s, with the youngest being only 14 years old. Needles in, needles out, needles in, needles out. When one was called away from work and never seen again, Marta would quickly arrange for another to take her place. In this room, they had names. Beyond the salon, they were nameless, only numbers. The working conditions for the dressmakers of Auschwitz, while slightly better than those of other prisoners, was still part of a brutal system of slave labor where life was precarious and death was ever present. The dressmakers were forced to work grueling shifts, often 12 to 14 hours a day, every day. They worked around the clock and slept in shifts. They were expected to produce a high volume of work, such as creating 2 dresses per week. The fabrics, threads, and other materials they used were looted from the belongings of murdered Jewish people arriving at the camp. While still a form of slave labor in a death camp, the dressmakers experienced some privileges that separated them from most other inmates. The workshop was located in a clean, heated space inside the staff building and had amenities like running water, toilets, and showers. This was a tremendous advantage over the overcrowded, filthy barracks of Birkenau, which was plagued by typhus and rampant disease. They received slightly more and better quality food than other prisoners, although their rations were still meager and consisted mainly of soup, bread, and occasionally margarine or sausage. The women wore better quality confiscated clothing instead of standard prison uniforms. Working in the workshop meant they were shielded from the random and terrifying selections, which sent thousands to the gas chambers. The work, though forced, was meaningful and allowed the women to maintain a sense of dignity and human connection, fostering camaraderie. Despite their comparatively better situation, the dressmakers were not exempt from the atrocities of Auschwitz. The threat of being sent to the gas chambers if their work was deemed unsatisfactory, or no longer needed was constant. For example, the studio was abruptly disbanded in January 1945 as the Red Army approached, and the prisoners were forced on a death march to other camps. One of the dressmakers, Katka Berkowitz, the younger sister of Mrs. Berta Berkowitz-Kohut, even discovered her own father's coat in the warehouses of confiscated belongings, knowing instantly that her parents had been murdered. Mrs. Berta Berkowitz-Kohut, born November 8, 1921, died February 14, 2021, was the last surviving dressmaker from the fashion salon established at Auschwitz. Kohut was a Czechoslovakian-born survivor of the Auschwitz concentration camp. By the time of her death, at the age of 100 years, Mrs. Kohut was the last surviving seamstress who lived through the internment at the camp by creating dresses for the wives of Nazi officers. A big black order book was filled. A 6-month waiting list included very high-status clients in Berlin. Priority for orders was given to their local clients, and the woman who established the salon, Hedwig Haas, the wife of the commandant of the Auschwitz concentration camp. The forces that converged to create a fashion salon in Auschwitz were also responsible for shaping and fracturing the lives of the women who would eventually work there. 2 decades earlier, when the dressmakers were young girls or mere infants, they would have no concept of how their fate would converge in such a place. Even the adults in their living lives would have struggled to comprehend a future that included couture sewing in the midst of industrialized genocide. In 1933, the German Jewish journalist Bella Fromm noted in her diary that Hitler had declared, "The Berlin women must become the best dressed women in Europe. No more Paris models." The same year, Joseph Goebbels, Reich Minister of Enlightenment and Propaganda, put him in charge of the fashion house. Goebbels recognized the power of the fashion industry to shape image, which he knew was crucial for controlling behavior. He only wanted to dictate how women presented themselves, supporting roles only. He also wanted to control the power of the clothing industry. This meant ousting the Jews. Removal of the Jewish people from the fashion industry and clothing trade as a whole was not an accidental byproduct of anti-Semitism. It was a goal to be achieved through blackmail, threats, sanctions, boycotts, extortion, and forced liquidations. Marta, Hanya, Bracha, Irene, and countless other young Jewish women would all suffer because of it. They would endeavor to survive despite it. One of the most powerful tactics to achieve control of the Jewish people and their assets was to draw on primitive tribal mentality, mistrust of the other. In emphasizing the difference between Jews and non-Jews, rebranded as Aryans in nationalist terminology, the Nazis deliberately manufactured divisions between us and them. To emphasize the us element of cohesion, they cleverly exploited the power of belonging created when groups wear a uniform. Uniforms minimized obvious differences between different classes, giving the impression of equality within the ethnic group. The Nazi movement was so readily identified with clothing before coming to power. Their men on the street were known as the brown shirts. Bella Fromm noted how the men strutted around like peacocks and seemed to be intoxicated by their own masquerade. Even more sinister was the psychological power of the uniform to help the wearer live up to the image. The brown shirts played a big role in growing violence directed at the clothing industry. Their power was surpassed by those who wore the darkest fabrics, SS uniforms. Even without a uniform, the Nazi swastika was a symbol, black on red, transforming neutral clothes into a statement. The reason Goebbels' propaganda juggernaut was so readily make the connection between fashion and Jews was because the clothing industry was heavily reliant on Jewish talent, Jewish connections, and Jewish capital. Roughly 80% of department stores and chain store businesses were owned by German Jews in interwar Germany. Almost half the wholesale textile firms were Jewish too. Jewish workers made up a huge number of those employed in designing, making, transporting, and selling clothes. Berlin was an acclaimed center of women's ready-to-wear apparel, thanks to the energies and intelligence of Jewish entrepreneurs over a century of development. On April 1st, 1933, at 10 a.m., there began a national boycott of German Jewish businesses by Aryan Germans. It was carefully orchestrated by the Nazi Party. Hitler had been made chancellor in January of that year. The Nazis had only been fully in power since March. Clearly, anti-Jewish measures were a major priority for the new regime. Incredible excitement in the air, read Joseph Goebbels' diary entry of April 1st, 1933. Kauft nicht bei Juden, don't buy from Jews. When intimidation turned to violence, including throwing objects, breaking the windows of the elegant Jewish-owned department store Titz in Berlin, police were rarely intervened. Broken windows were symbols of the fragile, secure sense of security the Jewish traders now had. After 24 hours of harassment, the boycott was called off. Intermittent violence continued. It had proved that in 1933, most non-Jewish Germans were still relatively apathetic about anti-Semitic actions, and it had antagonized foreign governments who protested against the intimidation. Nazi leaders were exasperated at the foreign response. They had emphasized that only German Jews were to be harassed, not foreign Jews. Complaints about the boycott were dismissed by the government as Jewish atrocity propaganda. If there had been issues, Nazis explained, Jews were told that they had brought it upon themselves. Even though the boycott was called off, it had laid the groundwork for increased pressure on Jewish businesses and paved the way for ever more sophisticated ways of controlling trade. Countless Jewish garment workers in Germany, including Hanya Volkmann in her Leipzig salon, would have next their livelihoods threatened with the initiative launched in May 1933, only a month after the boycott, with the long-term aim of making every aspect of the clothing trade Jew-free. This was ADEFA, an acronym for Arbeitsgemeinschaft Deutsch-Arische Fabrikanten der Bekleidungsindustrie, the Federation of German Aryan Manufacturers of the Clothing Industry. As plenipotentiary for the four-year plan, Hermann Goering was responsible for gearing up German economy for war. He certainly saw Kristallnacht damage as a crisis, complaining that there was no point to him crafting frugal policies when pogroms caused massive losses to the economy. His response to Kristallnacht vandalism was brazen. He presented German Jews with a staggering high bill to cover the damage. Emmy Goring, Hermann's wife, was a devotee of fabulous clothes. In her memoirs, she admitted to feeling uneasy at anti-Semitic boycotts, making it clear that she had done her small bit to support some Jewish friends who had Jew daubed on their shop windows. However, she admitted to feeling uncomfortable going into Jewish shops, afraid it would mean trouble for her husband. Joseph Goebbels, meanwhile, gloated in his diary that Berliners were enraptured by the loot of Kristallnacht. Significantly, he highlighted the fact that clothes and soft furnishings were the main prizes acquired. Fur coats, carpets, valuable textiles, all were to be had for nothing. In Leipzig, During the early hours of November 9th and 10th in 1938, the famous department store Bamberger's, Hertz's, and Uri's was set ablaze. Local fire brigades rushed to make sure flames did not spread to non-Jewish buildings. They did nothing to save the shops themselves. In Germany as a whole, an estimated 6,000 to 7,000 Jewish businesses were looted and trashed. The German public were too frightened to intervene or too eager to benefit. The mass devastation became known as Kristallnacht, Night of the Broken Glass. It is an invocative term, so very telling that the events were in terms in property and not people. Broken glass, not broken lives. Reichsmarshal Göring complained to Goebbels, "I wish you had killed 200 Jews instead of destroying such valuables." Although Kristallnacht had shown German citizens the ugly reality of life for Jews, perhaps they took selfish comfort from the thought that it was happening to other people, that families harried through the streets in their night clothes must have done something wrong to be treated in such a discordant way. Honya, one of the gutsiest of the future group of dressmakers, arrived at Auschwitz on a very hot day in June of 1943. Hers was the very last train of Jews to leave Leipzig. Honya joined the others at Wachterstrasse, the gathering point. She recognized many faces in the crowd. She felt confident she could summon the resilience to face anything. Her strength was contagious and it would be needed. After 2 days of discomfort and dread, they were harried from the jail to the main Leipzig railway station, where their train waited. Honya found space in the cattle car with a friend, dentist Ruth Ringer, and Ruth's husband, Hans, who had been a doctor at the hospital. At one stop, a convoy of disabled and elderly people from a care home was added to the train. Their helpers felt powerless when their patients suffered severe maladies and disturbed episodes. The sick grew worse. The dead were bundled out and the toilet buckets were emptied whenever the train stopped. The train stopped one final time. A lamp illuminated a huge sign, Auschwitz. Now there were no jokes, no genteel conversations, only dread. The latest transport had arrived, and of the hundreds of Jews on board, only 2 would survive to liberation. Just before men were separated from women, Dr. Renger turned to his wife Ruth and said, "Stick together with Honya. I have a feeling she'll make it." Irene, Berta, Bracha, Katka, Marta, Alice, Olga, Alida, Marilu, Barishka, Hanya, needles in, needles out. Whichever train they traveled on, new arrivals at Auschwitz all faced the same sickening moment when the doors opened and the screaming began. Los! Los! Heraus und anleihen! Move it, get out, and form lines. It was a long jump down from the railway car to the platform called the ramp. Transports for the concentration camp were brought to this sideline. Not far from the ramp were railway houses built for staff working on the busy main line through Auschwitz that connected Vienna in Austria with Krakow in Poland. 14-year-old Boguslava Glowacka lived in one of those houses. She worked as a maid for one of the SS men and would sometimes meet prisoners from tailors and cobbler shops when running errands in the main camp at Auschwitz. Boguslava said it was impossible not to see the trains being unloaded. The moment the train stopped, an incredible uproar broke out with the screams of the SS men, the sobbing and howling of the people being unloaded, the barking of dogs, and the sounds of gunshots. For a few moments, the new arrivals stood in free air as civilians. Normal people. Looking around, they noticed men wearing striped suits working in the fields. "We thought they were mentally deranged," said one of the new girls. assuming that the shaved heads and uniforms meant they were patients from a mental institution. Later transports, which include families and elderly people, were greeted by the reassuring sight of big trucks with the sign of the Red Cross. Where there is the Red Cross, it can't be too bad, thought one Slovakian girl arriving in July 1942. She did not know then that Oswald Pohl, the head of the concentration camp administration, was also chairman of the German Red Cross Board of Administration. This created a hideous collaboration. The trucks that inspired arrivals with confidence were in fact to drive people straight to the gas chambers. By July, measures were in place to murder new arrivals considered surplus to labor requirements. From July onwards, Jewish transports to Auschwitz were sorted on the platform for life or death. In March and April of 1942, when the Slovakian transports first arrived, there were no selections for the gas. The women had come to work. They were marched past quarries, kilns, and brick dumps towards the gate of Stammlager, or main camp, as also known as Auschwitz I. The gate, forged by inmate blacksmith Jan Liewatz, had originally been the entrance to Auschwitz, but the camp complex had long since outgrown this initial security perimeter. Seamstress Alice Strauss looked up at the sign as she passed beneath it. Arching over the gate was the wrought iron metal declaration, Arbeit macht frei, work sets you free. A high concrete barrier separated the men from the women's area. Bracha's transport from Prapad came too late on the day in April 3rd to undergo immediate processing. Instead, the women were marched through the camp to the line of red brick barrack blocks. Bracha, Katka, and the others were hustled into one of them. The buildings had originally been for industrial workers to be near the town's railway hub, where they were used by the Polish army. Now housed women's prisoners. On the other side of the brick wall was the commandant's comfortable house on Legionov Street, built in 1937 by a Polish prisoner named Sergeant Jocha, who was evicted with very limited notice on July 8, 1940, under the watchful eyes of armed SS. The whole neighborhood was to be cleared for the German occupiers. This was no gracious hostess and no Slovakian welcome for the arrivals in the camp prison blocks. Instead, the Slovakian women found themselves under orders from other prisoners called kapos, bosses or squad leaders. These were mainly German women, non-Jews, incarcerated as criminals or enemies of the state, and transferred from Ravensbrück concentration camp shortly before the first Slovakian transport arrived. For many concentration camp prisoners and for people in post-war society, the word capo became synonymous with cruelty and violence. Survivor testimonies made clear that capos were degraded by temperament and or intolerable circumstances, did indeed become perpetrators as well as victims. Even so, not everyone was forced into the role of capo and abused the position. When she was eventually chosen as capo of the Upper Tailing studio, Marta Fuchs would become one of those who used her privileged prison status to secure relative safety and dignity for the women of this work squad. On arrival at Auschwitz, Marta was just one more bewildered inmate, hustled into a hostile environment. The ultimate fate of the seamstresses varied, but many were forced on the death march from Auschwitz in 1945. Many of them survived due to their close-knit network and the relationships they had formed. After liberation, some of the survivors went on to open new sewing businesses and maintained contact with each other. Irene, Bracha, Katka, Marta, Alice, Olga, Alida, Marilu, Barishka, Hanya, needles in, needles out. Thank you. Okay, Rich?